Hey guys, we're here for another week of the Software Cooperatives Meetup. It's September 5th, and today we're doing a book review over Logic of Collective Action. It's written by Mancur Olson, and it's a very interesting read. And so, without any further ado, Watson, take it away. We're going to dive into some really nice conversations, and so I'm excited.
All right. Thanks a bunch, Josh. And as always, we got a mind map to help us remember what we were reading. So, just to start on this book, the main reviewer for this book is Thomas Schelling. He's a Nobel Prize winner, and some of his ideas are in here. Um, so, as far as economics, so it's pretty rigorous, Harvard University Press. So it's kind of like a stance of what group theory or how it was thought of, at least in the 70s, by from the economic standpoint. And I'd like to see if there are any significant updates that we could apply to it just from our personal experiences, especially from open source as a cooperative, from things that we've seen. Okay, so I think one of the things, just an overview from what that I got from the book, and anyone else that tried to read through some of it, probably try to get some of your overviews before I even try to get into anything. Um, I think it was pretty. I think one thing about an economic standpoint is it's rigorous to the point of, like, you have your common assumptions that humans are going to be rational, and we know that humans aren't perfectly rational. Economists kind of know that too. They're just, put this out there and then say, okay, at a certain threshold, the humans, through either ideology or something like that, they might do something that's irrational, and that's fine. But that's where they try to concentrate on things. So I kind of go into this with that in the back of my head. I thought that it wasn't too bad for an economics book. It was definitely not bad. Economics books usually have, I don't know, physics envy or something, where they try to really make things a little bit too mathematical. But this one was supposed to be for almost like an average reader. So um, there's some counterintuitive truths in here, and that's kind of what I look for in any type of influential book. And this is an influential book as far as group theory is concerned. And I expect with a book like this, where it's coming from a place like Harvard University Press, uh, to have a strong stance, be controversial, and so on and so forth. So when it's something like this, I expect there to be, I don't know, kind of a pushback when it comes out of economics, because all the different fields, they all have their view on how humans behave. So anybody else want to talk about like what their general idea or feel that they got from the book? Just like high level, what they thought, how it made them feel.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. I guess the counterintuitive truths, which you just pointed out. So it seemed, I guess, my feel on it at first, I was thinking it was going to just focus on it's not possible to ever see altruistic behavior or anything, and it talked about places where you can see that and seemed to indicate where you're going to start seeing boundaries and stuff. And then areas where, right in the introduction, it starts going into here's where you can see groups together and rationally you would think they would work well together. And then to meet those common goals, which would be good for themselves as an individual. But that's like right from the start made it more interesting. So you were saying that from an economic standpoint, the math and everything, a lot of it didn't seem as brutal as far as against other fields that think about these things. So I don't know. It seems somewhat balanced on that, but it is old, so it reads a little different than some things today.
Anyone else? Just comments, high level feelings, whatever.
I was immediately just interested in the book once I read the summary of it. Very interesting. Just from even like a cooperative standpoint to just bringing like-minded individuals together for a greater good. For a greater, and I'm thinking like as far as monetarily, it's just for to receive greater value. I got through most of the mind map, a bit of the book, but for what I'm seeing in the mind map, I'm definitely going to dive more into the book. The the irrational tendencies of humans is definitely not a surprise. Run into it all the time with these economic papers and even studying it, and then see it true in real life. But it's just what I'd like to really talk more about is in those groups where self-interest of an individual overrides the agreed upon priority of the group. When is that? When does that trigger? And like, what are some of those like? What are the common triggers for that? Is it fear? Is it greed? Are they just hungry? And so I think like, and maybe it goes into it in the book. I'd love to talk more about that, but that's that interesting piece because just offhand, of course, if we all get together and we can do more, like it's a no-brainer. But then where does things go? Where do things go sideways? But those are just my high-level thoughts.
Great. That's excellent. Anyone else have just high level feelings, anything about this whole concept? All right. I'm going to go ahead and jump in and try to give some of what I thought or think is like the counterintuitive truths, things that are big takeaways, what the average person would think, and then trying to make it to where, oh, this isn't really a bike shed kind of thing. That's where I find it to be interesting in any of these reviews from any literature, any book that I read. Does it give me something that I wouldn't just think of just sitting around on the couch, right? So that's with this book, with this concept, and with the concept of groups. Let's just go ahead and take it from the top. It's often taken for granted, at least where economic objectives are involved, that groups of individuals with common interests usually attempt to further those common interests. So groups, right? Groups of individuals with common interests are expected to act. And I'm going to keep bringing that up. The word act is very important. on behalf of their common interests as much as single individuals are often expected to act on behalf of their personal interests, right? So that's important, right? People think that the group, when you join the group, when you act within the group, it's just like when you act as an individual. And here's the big problem statement of the book, but it is not in fact true that the idea that groups will act, and I put the asterisk around the word act, in their self-interest, and that it follows logically from the premise of rational and self-interested behavior. It does not follow because all of the individuals in the group would gain if they achieve their group objective, that they would act to achieve that objective, even if they were all rational and self-interested. Indeed, unless the number of individuals in a group is quite small, or unless there is coercion or some other special device to make individuals act on their common interest, rational, self-interested individuals will not act to achieve their common or group interests. All right. So if members of a large group rationally seek to maximize their personal welfare, they will not act to advance their common or group objectives unless there is a coercion to force them to do so, or unless some separate incentive distinct from the achievement of the common or group interest is offered to the members of the group individually on the condition that they help bear the cost for the burdens involved in the achievement of the group objectives. So right there, we can kind of just stop and contemplate this whole thing. Right. So they're saying when you're part of a large group, one of the things that is not clear here, well, I tried to make clear, is he's talking about action. He's not talking about just merely joining. In the book, when he's talking about joining, it's action if you have to pay dues, if there's some cost. But if there's no cost, there's no action. So just merely joining the group's not a large group, that's nothing. But a large group doing and providing some type of good, and we're going to get into that later of what a good is. They're saying that if an individual can receive that good without doing anything, they're not going to act while they're within the group. Is that, and we're going to just probably go over this a couple more times. Some key things: large group, not small group, large group, action, not just joining, right? So some cost, right? And you aren't coerced if you're in a large group. So everyone right now, to make it real, like think of large groups that you're part of, that you act within that group, right? And you weren't coerced, right? And then just that alone, right? And then what all do you think? What comes to mind when you think about that? Does anybody have any? Does anything just pop up to anybody?
Sure. We're all part of the open source community, so it's a very large community.
Right. And that's really how I think of it too. And then of course we reviewed commingled code. I believe we've probably reviewed some other ones over the past couple of years, and I've definitely quoted a bunch. His concept of action and his concept of an incentive, we're going to get into it later, but this is where I have a problem with economists, right? But previously they always wanted, they kind of want to have their cake and eat it too. They want to say, if it's not the profit motive, no, it doesn't count. Social, ideological don't count. That's something else. We don't care about it. But then when something breaks their model, then they'll allow it to count. Right? So social incentives, he's already at the kind of saw it because he used the word prestige instead of reputation. Same thing. He kind of saw it and said, oh, yeah. If you individually will receive prestige, okay, well, that's what he calls it, a selective incentive. That's an individual incentive. And then that will, that's going to, what incentivizes you to act, not the group. So this is the group good and group incentive versus the individual incentive. And right. And so I'm kind of getting ahead of ourselves, but I really wanted to cut right to the chase. And that's how I think if this guy was doing a presentation with this, he would try to present it. It's like, oh, no, you get reputation in open source when you're a part of the community. And so that reputation goes towards you getting the job and all that stuff. Just like how we saw in Commingle Code. And I mean, I've read like maybe at least 6 different open source economics books. So they all just include reputation. I don't like how they have your cake and eat it too. That's my critique of the book, right? I don't like that part. They just go ahead and include social incentives as part of an incentive. That's, and stop trying to do just profit. But I think that's the first call out, that I have to Lucina. Does anybody else think of any large group at all? I don't have one in mind. So it's not like I'm trying to, there's something out there that there's critiques, whatever. His claim is that there's large groups that you could be a part of or whatever, but unless there's coercion, a good deal of people won't act inside the group. So
did he give an example of a specific type of coercion? Like
coercion? Yeah. I mean, there's a million. I'll skip right to one. I mean, you're not the national, right? Coercion. You're part of the United States. Guess what? You're a man. Yeah, you get to have the draft.
Right.
Pretty soon, they're probably gonna have women in the draft. But right now, guess what? You can go to war and die, and that's coercion. So, that's one. Hey, if you don't like that example, taxes, right? So, I mean, that's a large group. You're part of it, and that's been talked about for literally like a couple thousand years, right? But that's one, and some people are like, it doesn't count. I don't want to count that. But just any large group, labor unions, I just didn't even want to include that in this mind map. There's a whole chapter on labor unions, and labor unions are his big one that he wants to bring out, where it's like, oh yeah, labor unions have mandatory dues. Like you join a job, they have something called the Wagner Act and all this stuff where they try to make it to where you have to pay the dues. You have to be part of the labor union when you actually are employed. I've never experienced that, but that's part of that whole discussion. I didn't want to use that as too much of an example, but that's his favorite.
In the spirit of like essentially being a part of a group, working and to advance the group, I think of like fraternal orgs, especially even post-college, where people will still pay dues voluntarily and do service and for the betterment of the group.
Right. And so I think his thing with that, there's a couple dynamics there. So he has a concept of federation. So there's small groups and large groups. And the small group, like if you could just join, let's say a fraternity or sorority and just be like, I'm here. And then it's like, well, what do you get from it? You get the reputation. Like, oh, okay. His thing, there's a bunch of things I think he would critique. He didn't talk about that, but there's a bunch of things I think he would critique about that. Like, first off, he would say it would die if there wasn't a big cost when you joined and all this stuff. Also, it's small groups. when you join at a certain school, it's small, face to face, and that's your he complete large groups are not face to face. And so I can just go ahead and move over to number 2 here. But small groups are going to be, I'm sorry, small groups are face to face. They come from like you can think of the idea of kinship, families, all these other types of things. But the smaller groups, they don't apply to this. They're within the theory, but you can have people who can bear the cost. There'll be a couple of individuals that can bear the cost with a small group, and then have what we call now free riders. But and there's no problem. But I think he would try to apply that to fraternal fraternities, sororities, and stuff like that. But I think that's one.
Yeah, I could see him doing that, especially at the start in undergrad. Definitely small groups. After that, I mean, it's like, millions of people or whatever. But I think
remember, it's action.
Yeah.
It's action. So what do people do after? And how much do they do after they already do their pledging and all that stuff?
Yeah,
like that?
I think there's still tons, action is still hundreds of thousands, but they're still separated into chapters. And so you still have that small group effect. So yeah, okay.
Yeah, so
okay,
cool. Let's see what else here. He goes back, starts talking about Aristotle. The concept of groups there's just so many people who have different concepts of groups, who base it generally on the idea that you join a group for a common interest, right? Here's one of his, a statement that come up. There's obviously no purpose in having an organization where an individual or unorganized action can serve the interests of the individual as well or better than an organization. There would, for example, be no point in forming an organization simply to play solitaire, right? Okay, so again, he's going to start talking about some of the heavy hitters in political science, some of the other heavy hitters in like social psychology, and he's saying, here's their quotes, right? There's no group without its interest, and every group has its interest, right? Let's go ahead and we're on number 2. I'm going to go ahead and go to number 3. Let me find that, or did I skip it? Yeah, public goods and large groups. Okay, so I'm going to briefly go over this. So his kind of claim and why he thinks that, he's qualified to comment about this and say he's right, other people are wrong, and all that stuff, is saying that economists study markets all day, and we study groups, which are corporations and people who enter the market, anyone trying to sell something. And he uses the analogy of large groups and small groups, and he talks about competitive markets, perfect competition, which basically means a market with lots and lots of people selling in that market, right? And there's a problem there, which is a common problem. Like there's 2 ways to look at markets at a high level. There's the price competition, which another name for that is Bertrand competition. Now he didn't use a term, but that's one. And the other one is Cournot, which he did refer to. And so it's okay if everyone in the market, and you can kind of think of we're all in the labor market. We sell our labor, and some of us, also sell services as a group, whatever, right? If everyone that's a services company or a product company or whatever goes in and they're saying, hey, we're $200 an hour, we're all fine. But guess what? One person comes in and says that they're $190 an hour. Or they come in and they advertise that they're $180 an hour. They come in and, right? And so everybody is in this competitive situation where it's kind of the fundamental idea of free markets, that the price will go to the almost like perfect place in a competitive market where, you know, there isn't any, it's very, I want to say economical. It's very efficient, right? So there isn't, the cost for something isn't too much because there's lots of competition. Somebody would go ahead and go to someone else, right? So we all know that. And as far as someone that sells something on the market, so what do? Let's just go ahead and say for products, right? You know, we make iPhones or we make just phones or whatever. And if you put, the market can serve, let's just say 1 million phones, and there's a bunch of competitors. We know that if we start, you know, selling the phones, you know, we're selling for $1,000, somebody sells them for 900, advertises it, we're going to have a whole bunch of inventory on our hands. We're not going to sell our inventory. The other side is, if we all, this is the point, you know, we all got together and said, in collusion, and said, hey, how about we all don't produce too much, right? Because that's going to make us have extra inventory. We're going to lose money, right? It's just stuff sitting around. Let's just not produce too much. Let's just keep it to where we all make, you know, a profit. We all sell, you know, 50,000 iPhones a year or something like that. You know, there's 100 of us selling phones. We're gonna sell, you know, let's all sell 50,000 or whatever. We do that, we would maximize our profits. But the problem is that one person, right? This is where the small group and the big group comes in, right? So because it's a big group, one person can benefit by not taking the action, right, of not producing more and not putting their price list, right? So one person can say, I want to go ahead and we're selling them for 1,000. I'm going to sell them for 800, and I'm just going to make a killing this year, right? And it messes up. You have to have full consensus. And he talks about this in a book, but I didn't put it in my map. You have to have full consensus. If you're a large group, it's not happening. In order to make the collective action work that way, there has to be individual incentives for it to work. So his thing is comparing it to markets, comparing it to what's called coordinate competition and all that stuff. So that is what that whole section is about, is when he starts talking about all this math and all that stuff. You can go ahead and read. There's other people who talk about coordinate competition better than this guy. So I would say read about that on Wikipedia if you want. So any questions about that as far as a comparison to large groups? Again, let me say, he's saying for a large group, it's like having perfect competition, right? Lots of people who all want to partake in the collective good, right? And then, but they all don't have the incentive, right? Individual incentive to participate. They actually will make more if they don't participate. And the making more, again, as the individual would be, one thing could be just being lazy, just not doing anything. That's, you don't incur the cost. That's the idea. So does anybody have any comments about that? Okay.
So I guess the one thing was, this was mainly talking about the larger groups and where that could have an effect. It seems like it could still have an effect on smaller groups, and it's just maybe easier to manage or something, or what's the deal on the boundary?
Okay, so that's a good question. He almost wants to define a large group as the one with this problem, and a small group with the one that doesn't have this problem. He also even puts intermediate groups. He starts talking about intermediate groups, where it's kind of what he uses the term indeterminate, so you don't know. But that's his, like, the theory of groups is that small groups are the ones that don't have this issue, right? They have the individual. It's hard for me not to go into game theory because game theory to me explains it way better. But the individual, and we talked about this before, if there's a coalition that's made and then there's a payout, it doesn't matter if a coalition 3 gets made, right? And 3 people, they make $10. Well, let's make it something that's worthwhile, right? $10,000. 3 people make $10,000, but all 3 don't make any money if they don't form the coalition, right? You might remember that from one of our older papers. Then, right? So and I'm going to add on to it. So the coalition of 3 makes $10,000. The coalition of 0, right? Or just everyone just stays on their own makes $0, right? This happens all the time in all kinds of places, right? Now, the coalition comes together. Let's say there's work to be done, action. One of those people, right? They, out of that $10,000, like they did 90% of the work, or they did 70% of the work, let's just say, right? Let's just say 70%. Small groups can still bear that. That can still happen where let's all get together. I'm going to take 70% of this. I do 70% of the money of the work I'm going to receive. Let's just say he receives just 50%. He or she receives just 50% of the payout of the 10,000. So they only make 5,000. It still bears. That still happens in real life. We witness it. We know, like, Pareto principle, things like the 80-20 rule, all those types of things, like 20% of your people do 80% of the valuable work, all these things like that. We see it all over the place with smaller groups and stuff like that, right? So that's kind of the concept of the small group. He's really trying to define it as the one. And that saying that when you're defining groups and group theory, and we're going to get into that, and I think the traditional, there are problems when you do the traditional view of defining groups. So I think maybe in here we'll probably go over it even more in detail. Anyone else? All right, 7:40. So I'm gonna try to get through some of this. Let's see here. Group theory appears to be one of the principal concerns of many political scientists. This is where he's just taking shots at everybody that talks about groups. Political scientists in the United States, as well as a major preoccupation of many sociologists and social psychologists. So he's calling people out. In its most casual form, the traditional view, right, which I think is the intuitive view. This is just something, if I'm sitting around, I might think of about, is that private organizations of groups are ubiquitous, and that this ubiquity is due to a fundamental human propensity to form and join associations, right? And he goes, there's more quotes in the book, but I'll just go ahead. It's like the herd mentality, all these phrases that we heard before. It begins with the fact that primary groups so small that each of the members has face-to-face relationships with the others, like family and kinship groups, are predominant in primitive societies, right? That's like what they call primary groups and all that concept, right? And he's got some definitions, all that stuff. But social theorists contain, as society develops, there's a structural differentiation. New associations emerge to take on some form of the functions that the family had previously undertaken. As the social functions performed by the family institution in our society have declined, some of these secondary groups, such as labor unions, have achieved a rate of interaction that equals or surpasses that of certain primary groups, right? So, I mean, you may just think about any book that you read that someone has commented about groups. It's kind of a pervasive, overarching, massive topic. And people just have opinions or ideas, even empirical, research and theories, all that stuff like that. And I do find that this concept is how people think about groups. Like we just form. Sometimes we just form to have fun, or we form for whatever ideological reasons, stuff like that. And but we don't really think of that separation of large and small. This is, and it tries to have an explanation of large and small, different from family unit, kinship unit, all these things like that. So then he gets more formal. A formal variant of the traditional view also emphasizes the universality of groups, but does not begin with any instinct or tendency to join groups. Instead, it attempts to explain the associations and group affiliations of the present day as an aspect of the evolution of modern industrial societies out of the primitive societies that preceded them. I don't have on here, I think it's Emil Durkheim, but big time, like he's like the father of sociology, and he talks about this all the time. I think the name, I'm forgetting the name of the book. I think it's called the Division of Labor. Like I think that's where that phrase comes from. Is that him? It may come from, the name of the book is that, and he's just talking about how societies became more complicated. We started having more law. We started having non-punitive law and all this stuff like that. The large voluntary association, for example, could then be explained by the fact that it performed a function. That's right. It exists, the collective good, that type of thing. That is satisfied a demand, furthered an interest, or met a need for some large number of people that small groups could not perform in modern circumstances. And then now, the traditional theory is called into question by the empirical research, which shows that the average person does not, in fact, typically belong to large voluntary, not compulsory. That's important. Compulsory versus voluntary associations, and that illusion that the typical American is a joiner is largely a myth. Right? Though all the members of the group therefore have a common interest in obtaining this collective benefit, they have no common interest in paying the cost. So you've got a common interest. You want to get the whatever it is. Like in my mind, I keep thinking reputation. And you keep thinking if you're part of this group, it could be as little as reputation. And that's kind of what could be motivating you. But definitely if it's all together, you're making more money, whatever. And they have no common interest. This is the counterintuitive truth that I think that he's getting at. You don't have a common interest in paying the cost. Right? You want to say, no, there's an altruistic, so it is a common interest. He's saying, no, you don't have a common interest. There's no common interest for an individual to pay the cost of providing that collective good. Each would prefer that the other pay the entire cost, right? So this is either, you can call it a counterintuitive truth, or you can call it, an unattractive truth, or you can just call it just being mean. I don't know what you're going to call it, but that's what he's getting at there. And ordinarily would get any benefit provided whether it had borne the part of the cost or not. So there we go. And he's going to start talking about small groups. But anyone have some comments? All right.
Yeah, these are like very explicit
Yeah.
scenarios. And I'm just like, yeah.
Yeah. So compulsory, right? So when we come up with an example, compulsory is part of is it compulsory that you're part of the group or not? When you get in, did you have to pay the dues? When you get in, did you have to do, right? If it's compulsory, out the window. That's not what he's talking about. He's talking about voluntary for large groups, right? And then, and then of course, large versus small, what is small? He gets into just things. It's not face-to-face and all the stuff like that. So when it starts, I think I really want to say what we just went over. Small is at the point where you don't have that individual incentives in order to, you would rather other people pay. You don't have enough incentive. You want the collective benefit, but you don't have enough incentive to contribute. So that part is where it could be like, okay, but with an open source reputation, you have the individual incentive. So essentially, if I were following this theory, it's almost like developing Linux is a small group. And I would say, no, that seems that's like an unattractive premise to hold. I think developers of Linux, I forgot to go look it up, but it's large. It's like more than 10,000. It's a large amount of people, right? So I think that's where it's kind of like, there are individual incentives and it's large. I think that, and he tries to have a provision for that. He tries to have account for that, but I think that's where it might break as far as descriptions of large and small. So it's kind of, I think you have to end up going back to, okay, small is this kinship group thing, face to face, all that. Okay, so let's go over here. Let's see, where was I at? That's traditional theory. I don't want to get into all this math. So this whole section is about small groups. All right, so it's not enough to know whether a small group will provide itself with a collective good. It's also necessary to determine whether the amount of the collective good that a small group will obtain, if it obtains any, will tend to be Pareto optimal, which means, like we talk about Pareto optimability, I guess, before, like no one can do better. It's just at the concept at a high level. No one can do a move where they make out more and everyone else stays the same. Let's just leave it at that. It follows from the very definition of a collective good that an individual cannot exclude others in the group from the benefits of the amount of public good he provides for. The definition of collective good, now we just kind of just call it like non-rival. So no one can exclude. And the definition of property, if you own something, that means you have the right to exclude someone else. That's a definition. That is one definition of property, right? So you could say a collective good, you don't own it. It's kind of owned by the group, but you can't exclude anyone. The group can exclude people who aren't in a group from it, but you can't exclude, right? But that's even strange with open source, right? Because when you have something like GPL or whatever, you can't exclude anyone from it, right? So that's that kind of collective good. Everyone in the group, out the group, it's like the world is a group for that. So that's just a strange situation.
That's what I was going to say. It's trying to make the group to be everyone.
Right. So that's he does have the concept of a public good. And he does say public good versus collective good. So it's a public good, anyone can do it, but can do it or whatever, or partake in it. But the concept of the important part is who can exclude. And so it's collective good for the large group. What causes an issue is that no one can exclude someone else from that good. Right. And then the person that is part of a large group, they have to, again, I'll just keep saying this, is the concept of the book, is that you have to have what he calls like a selective incentive, something for the individual to have motivation in order to contribute to the large group, to have action, right? There's no, what he calls selective incentive. There won't be action for the individual, and the large group will like either dissipate or something like that. If it's again, voluntary group, not compulsory group, these things. The rest of this stuff is just, it's talking about, I know Taylor, you're interested in this, but it's talking about small groups, the dynamics of small groups. And I thought this was, so in any group where the participation is voluntary, the member or members whose shares of the marginal costs exceed their shares of the additional benefits will stop contributing to the achievement of the collective good before the group optimum has been reached. All right. So that reminded me of Google 20% time or the 3M time or whatever. And now we know that they have 20% time, but people don't partake in it. It's just, in name only, right? So people find out they have a good idea, they get out of there, right? So what this is an example, and then I've seen some of the critiques, like say Wikipedia critique. It said one of them was, oh, you've got critical mass. Like if you have some people who are like first movers, and then they get the hype train behind them, and you can have other people join in because they want to be part of it, and there's action, they're committing, right? And assuming they're not getting the reputation, because then that falls within this whole theory again. Let's say they're not getting a reputation, they're just contributing like a multi-level marketing scheme or something like that, right? They're contributing, and the people that are first movers are getting everything. So there's a large group, all that stuff like that. I think that his way of critiquing that is saying, yeah, eventually it's going to fail. And he has lots and lots of examples of associations which started out and in 20 years they were gone, or 30 years they were gone, and that kind of thing, and how they needed to move to compulsory membership, which is dues, these types of things, or assistance in some other way. But there was no, like, the small individuals were shirking. So Google 20% time. Before, you got Gmail. I've said this a bunch of times. Guy created Gmail. It's at least $6 billion project, right? There's no more Gmails, right? It's not a Gmail. By an individual going and doing that on 20% time, right? They're just people they go ahead and leave, right? If they have something that they want to work on. So there's it's like what in game theory call a repeated game. If it happens over and over again, people get wise to it. So, in any case, small groups, they can withstand it. Large, no. The most important single point about small groups in the present context, however, is that they may very well be able to provide themselves with a collective good simply because of the attraction of the collective good to the individual members. Just like I was saying before, with the group of 10,000, $10,000, three people, and how they might just say, okay, we're going to make out if we form, let's just go ahead and form. I want to say that it's called the Shapley. If we remember, Josh, if you remember, there was the von Neumann Morgenson algorithm for game theory, and then there was a Shapley one. And the Shapley one predicts outcomes based off of if a coalition will even form. If one forms, here's a payout. But if nothing forms, then there's no payout. And you have the examples of, say, a lawyer, engineer, and marketing person get together. They could have a product, let's say, but if they don't, all of them make nothing, kind of thing. And then who gets together and how do they negotiate who gets what doesn't matter. And now the concept of the Shapley, if you want to look that up. Let's go, because it is now almost 8. And that was small groups, taxonomy of groups. I'll go. Does anyone have any questions or anything? Comments?
Hadn't heard of that Shapley equation. I'm gonna check it out. No, I know about the Newman, but not the Shapley.
It's funny because I remember you almost liking that part of the paper, but you might not remember the name. What is the range of indeterminateness? This is talking about some of the things we were touching on, as far as there's intermediate groups, small groups, large groups. At some point, you don't know if there can be some payout. You don't know if there's individual, and then that's fine. It's still, he just tries to account for it. And it's all about action again. So he talks about the cost of communication. Josh, you might remember monitoring costs, and the more modern.
Oh yeah, definitely.
Exactly. So it costs to monitor, it costs to talk, it costs to set up, organize. People that organize, like we've seen, who knows, hey, This is a lot of work and it's not free, right? And so people that think, hey, let's just get together with their friends and it's just going to work, right? And then you get the fail well, right? And so I put that on here. Some of what Taylor is concerned with is the smallest type of group, the group in which one or more members get such a large fraction of the total benefit that they find it worthwhile to see that a collective good is provided, even if they have to pay the entire cost. May get along without any group agreement or organization. This group agreement organization is him talking about the communication, right? So small groups often come together, coalesce. They don't even have contracts, right? So that's not unheard of. All right, here's something important. So let's just talk about the group. He makes it more precise here. There are three separate but cumulative factors that keep larger groups from furthering their own interests. First, the larger group, the smaller the fraction of the total group benefit any person acting in the group interest receives, and the less adequate the reward for any group-oriented action, and the farther the group falls short of getting an optimal supply of the collective good, even if it should get some. I don't know if I copied everything. Oh, the larger the group, the smaller the fraction. Yeah. The larger the group, the smaller the fraction the total group benefit any person acting in the group interest receives. That's it. Right. So there's that. Okay. Second, since the larger the group, the smaller the share of the total benefit going to any individual or to any absolutely small subset of members of the group, the less the likelihood of any small subset of the group, much less any single individual, will gain enough from getting the collective good to bear the burden of providing even a small amount of it. Right? So again, it's talking about bear the burden. That's the action part. In other words, the larger the group, the smaller likelihood of the agapolistic interaction that might help obtain the good, right? And then third, the larger the number of members in the group, the greater the organization costs, and thus the higher the hurdle that must be jumped before any collective good at all can be obtained. And some of the stuff, I don't know, like I'd like to hear some feedback. Some of the stuff starts to sound kind of not counterintuitive, right? It starts to sound intuitive after looking at it enough to me. But it's just that I include social incentives when we're talking about large groups and all that stuff like that, just by default. But they're just talking about privileged groups, intermediate groups. Here's where, only a separate and selective action, this would be reputation, will stimulate a rational individual in a latent group. Latent group is a large group, right? So he's given a definition. He starts calling large groups latent groups. Latent group meaning you've got latent power. You got things you can act on. You can get mobilized maybe in some way, but the incentives is for you not to, right? You need to have a selective incentive, let's say reputation, that will stimulate a rational individual in the latent group to act in a group-oriented way. In such circumstances, group action can be obtained only through an incentive that operates not indiscriminately like the collective good, right? It's not right, you can exclude, or people are excluded from getting it, right? Upon the group as a whole, but rather selectively toward the individuals in the group. So anybody, any questions? We are rolling along and we've got like 5 minutes. So, all right, this is the part where I'm glad I'm just going to skip to here. There was 9, but I'm going to go ahead and skip to 10. Right? Economic incentives are not, to be sure, the only incentives. People are sometimes also motivated by a desire to win prestige, respect, friendship, and social and psychological objectives. Right? So take note, prestige is not considered an economic incentive. So whenever, this is where I just find tension constantly. So this is where have the cake, eat it too. It's like, oh yeah, let's include that too. All right. It's the nature of social incentives that they can distinguish among individuals, right? So that's saying it's not a collective good, it's all on you, like say, for instance, reputation, and then we got open source. So look at this. Social incentives are important mainly only in the small group. What? I don't know about that. And play a role in the large group only when the large group is a federation of small groups. Do I think Linux is a federation of small groups? If I squint and look at it, maybe the different parts of the kernel or something like that, things in user space, maybe. I don't know about that.
Different platforms.
Yeah.
Things.
But is it a federation of small groups? If you think, then he's accounted for what we're saying. I don't know. Right? And the incentives of reputation and all that stuff, I think it goes across, pretty well. Like you're a contributor to open source if you're working on kernels or whatever. I mean, maybe you could say, your reputation for working on a UX side is not gonna come over to drivers or kernel stuff. Maybe, I don't know. That would be 2 different groups, I could say, maybe. But the reputation is pretty strong, I think, and carries over. So let's see. Yeah, and this is everything in red is my comments, right? Perceptibility and reputation, like in open source, needs to be related. Perceptibility seems to be incentivized just as much as profit seeking in open source. Like that I don't know, I think that would make his jaw drop, in something that is essentially like it's a business product used best in class. For instance, for like on the web side, web servers, Apache's always been best in class, never been number 2, right? Well, since its inception, it was, the best in class. I don't know what it's like now, but it's never been number 2 to a closed source, right? And then, Linux server development is best in class, right? And it's been incentivized by a whole lot of, reputation, right? It's not, there's profit seeking on the corporate side, but the individuals we're talking about, right? So, any comments?
I'd like to see a critique of GNU Foundation when it was probably at its largest, or the members on that, where would be on the extreme side, I think, on some of these things.
Well, what do you mean?
Well, so Linux Foundation and some of the groups you can see, well, there's a breakdown in groups. So like what you talked about earlier, so all the subgroups and federation, there's a lot of other incentives. But then if you look at groups like the Free Software Foundation,
yeah,
and work in those, where some of the members, I guess maybe that could tie into prestige within the group, but nothing outside. Like it may not. There's people I've seen that have been working in a community like that for 15 plus years, and it doesn't seem like it's helped them as far as monetary for getting something else.
right.
But
social is, right. I guess this is a good place to stop. All that needed to be granted to accept the main argument of the study is that large or latent groups will not organize for coordinated action, not just joining, merely because as a group, they have a reason for doing so, right? So a reason for doing so as in a collective good, right? Though this could be true of smaller groups. So this is the thing, if you want to critique, that's the thing you want to come up with a counterexample of. Because this part right here, I want to say the Federation, I don't know about this applying to Linux. If he were to write the book now, he might just go ahead and take that out and just say, no, social incentives work. So whatever. Right. But I think outside of that, it does apply. I know I'd like to hear, because we're at the end, we have critiques. Let's hear the critiques of me, maybe even just thinking about that last statement. Large groups, small groups, compulsory, voluntary action, not just joining. Keep those in mind, and then that would be a proper what we're thinking of with this thing.
So I'm trying to think of examples of the large groups, not the Federation. My mind keeps going towards, I guess, political type of actions or groups coming together.
Yeah, this here, which we don't have enough time, but I could have gone through. Political action he has the byproduct theory. So he says that anybody that joins together in a large group that with political action, so lobbying, they will have a byproduct. If it's a large group, they'll have a byproduct for their members. So he goes into examples of like saying farmers insurance was one, big time, which you brought up talking about lawyers, right? The bar association, right? So he's talking about all the associations. Like you have to be part of the bar if you're an attorney. It's not an option, right? And so it's compulsory, right? So large group, end up having to be compulsory, but they do political action and all these things like that, lobbying for law surrounding around the trade association around that trade. And so that last part, I didn't think we were going to make it to it, and we weren't, right? So, but his last part is kind of like trying to sew it up, is as far as political action with large groups and all that stuff. He says they'll have a byproduct. So, anybody else? All right. I think we should stop it here and keep this thing to an hour.
Let me tie it up with, the next, or do we want with the next meetup and stuff?
Let's just stop.
Okay.
We'll do it.